The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Leon Charney Report. We have a really eclectic and exciting show tonight.
My name is Dr. Efraim Zuroff. I'm the Chief Nazi Hunter of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Director of the Israel Office, and in charge of Eastern European Affairs. I'm launching a book that I wrote together with a Lithuanian author, the most famous writer today in Lithuania, a woman named Ruta Vanagaita. And all we want is for the people to read the book. The book speaks for itself. And by the way, half of the book is our conversations after visiting the places. We taped the conversations, and we had plenty of arguments and all sorts of debates. And a lot of that book deals with motivation. Why these people did it. It was a combination of a lot of things. Combination of anti-Semitism, generations and generations of Catholic anti-Semitism. It was another factor was the economics. They wanted to rob the Jews, steal their property. Another factor was the alienation between Jews and non-Jews in Lithuania, because Jews are trying to preserve their traditions, preserve their way of life, preserve their religion, and they were more educated. They were usually living in the center of town. I'm talking about the provincial towns, 100,000 Jews in the provincial towns. They were living in the center of town. They were more educated. The Lithuanians were farmers, and they used to do business with the Jews, but there was a sense that maybe, the Jews are more successful than us. This is our country. Why are they so successful? Things of this sort. And listen, the conditions created by Nazi Germany in Lithuania, it was more natural for a Lithuanian to kill a Jew than to save a Jew. I say to you that you could say that there was a toxic combination between Christian anti-Semitism and the Nazis' racism. In other words, each one alone may not have yielded a Holocaust, but together they were a combination that created the conditions throughout Europe in which the norm was to kill a Jew. And that's an amazing thing. One of the things that I learned, for 45 years, studying the Holocaust, 35 years of hunting Nazis. And it took me a while to absorb, but the thing that really struck me was this, that most of the people who committed the crimes of the Holocaust were normative people. In other words, they were not involved in crime before the Shoah, they were not involved in crime after the Shoah, but during those years of the Third Reich, they committed some of the worst crimes imaginable against innocent people, helpless people, men, women, and children. Horrible stuff. I'll never forget, I met in Australia with the children, of a guy that I discovered who was involved in murdering Jews in Hungary. He murdered an 18-year-old boy in Budapest, who he caught without the yellow star. He knew he was a Jew. They grew up together in the same suburb. Took his body and threw it into the Danube in fall of 1944. And Hungary asked for his extradition from Australia. And the kids were desperate, and they couldn't believe it. He said to me, he was a good dad. I said to him, I'm not disputing that. He might really have been a good dad. He said, he never expressed any anti-Semitism. I said, that's also possible. He says, what you don't understand, I said to them, is that you have no idea what your father did during World War II. And during World War II, people did things that they didn't do before and they never did afterwards. Because of those conditions, economic conditions, and the political landscape created by Nazi Germany, which fit right into centuries of anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism. Very strong in Catholic countries, but also in Protestant countries. and the competition, in other words, the anti-Semitism on national grounds, on economic grounds, and all of this. And it all created what we call the Holocaust, with horrific results. I have a confession to make. Until this year, I think that I succeeded in keeping some distance, emotional distance, between myself and my job. In other words, I understood from a very young age that if I want to have a normal life, have a family, have things outside of work, I have to keep some distance between myself and this job. And I was successful. And thank God I have a family, I have 4 kids, I have 11 grandchildren, and I think I have a normal life. At least I had a normal life until this year. This year, 2 things happened. One thing is that I monitored and protested against 4 neo-Nazi marches, ultra-right marches in the Baltics. 2 in Lithuania, 1 in Latvia, and 1 in Estonia. Okay? And I came away very upset, very frustrated, very angry, And then I went on this mission. I started writing a book. I met Ruta Vanagaita. We decided we're going on a mission, and it turned out to be a mission to hell. In other words, every day we go 2, 3, 4 places of mass murder. They're in forests. Every single one is in a forest. All these Jews were shot near their homes, okay? Murdered individually. In many cases by their neighbors. In many cases, no Germans even present. In some cases, the only Germans present were taking photographs, not even shooting. And I'm seeing this. In every place, I say Kaddish, I say El Malei Rachamim, and I'm in shock. I can't grasp it. I can't grasp it. And on the way to the airport, after part of this mission, all of a sudden, I got the biggest anxiety attack. I never get anxiety attacks, okay? All of a sudden I say, how can I leave them? How can I leave them? They're lying there in the pits. Innocent people, innocent Jews, my people. My grandparents from Lithuania. Okay? They immigrated to America before the Shoah, long before World War I even. Okay? How can I do it? And it took me quite a few minutes just to get a grasp of myself and to say, you didn't betray them. You spent your life, you spent 25 years here in the trenches against the Lithuanians to try and get them to teach the truth, to try and get them to put the murderers on trial. You have nothing to be embarrassed about. Listen, I sometimes say facetiously, okay, that the Europeans never forgave us for Auschwitz. In other words, because those crimes, okay, which today are getting their due, okay, basically, you could say expose the ugly face of Europeans, of Europe, and the fact that Europe didn't fulfill its ideals. Because if Europe had fulfilled its ideals, the Holocaust could never have happened. And this is something that is weighing, it's deep down inside in the European psyche. But today, because of the Holocaust, in Western Europe, for example, it's politically incorrect. It's not acceptable to hate a Jew because he's different. Different religion, different language, let's say he has a Jewish language along with his regular language, he has different holidays, etc. That's out. But that hatred that is born, that is spawned by this incredible moral failure continues to gnaw at these people. So what happens? They basically transfer all this animosity, hatred towards Israel, towards the state of Israel. Israel among the nations is like the Jew among the other peoples of the world. And totally unfair. Because if there's one country in the world that is upholding European values, it's Israel. So they find themselves teaming up with the most primitive, benighted, prejudiced people in the world. We're talking about the Arab and Muslim neighbors here of ours who want to destroy us. At least some of them do, not all of them. Okay? And there's the result. You have they always say that politics makes the strangest bedfellows. How on earth do you explain that ultra-left people who pride themselves on human rights are willing to march with Hamas, who have openly admitted, openly spoken openly about their intention to destroy the state of Israel that protects human rights, that protects gay rights and women's rights, with these guys who are the most benighted people you would ever imagine. Anti-Semitism, it's very simple, that's the link. That's the link that throws them into bed together, in a sense. By profession, I'm not a lawyer by profession. I'm a historian by profession. Okay? And I spent many years studying. I have a PhD in the history of the Holocaust. And part of my motivation was to try to understand how it happened. And I would say to you even that to talk about irrationality here is a very dangerous thing, because it takes all of those crimes out of the context in which they can be held accountable. If someone is irrational and commits a crime, you put them in an insane asylum. You'd send them to a mental hospital. And I don't buy that, by the way. I think it is, in other words, these people knew what they were doing. And I can explain to you why they did it. And there's a variety of factors. It's not just one factor. It's not only the centuries of anti-Semitism. It's not only the racism. It's also economic factors, sociological factors, and a lot of different things that combine together at that time in those places to create these crimes. Because the easiest thing in the world is to say Hitler, he was a psychopath, okay? And maybe he was a psychopath, okay? But all those people, Hitler himself could never have done this. Hitler was able to harness an entire country, one of the biggest, strongest, most important countries in the world, and they in turn were able to spread this contamination, this plague, to all over Europe, from France in the west all the way to the gates of Moscow, from Narvik, Norway, near the Arctic Circle, all the way down to the Greek islands. And everyone bought in. The reason the rest of Europe bought was a combination of various political factors, German military might and force, and prejudices and ideologies that did not protect the vulnerable, in this case mostly Jews, but not only Jews. That's how dictatorships work. Can we learn from the lessons of the Holocaust? I personally think that we can learn from history. And it's important to learn from history. Not that history repeats itself exactly, but we can learn from certain phenomenon what to beware. What you have to understand is that, in a sense, the world has to acknowledge and understand, I think there is growing awareness in a certain respect, that the Holocaust was basically a test. The Holocaust put countries and individuals and societies to a test. And everyone responded in different ways. And if we examine and analyze those responses, we see where the mistakes were made, and we get a greater understanding of how this thing happened. To me, personally, I was born after the Shoah. Okay, I grew up in America. My parents were born in America. And I grew up in the Woodstock generation, right? Vietnam and all that. And the thing that really motivated me, I wanted to understand exactly the question that you're asking. How on earth was the Holocaust possible? I was politically active for Soviet Jewry, for Israel. We won certain victories, and later on, those victories became even greater when more than 1 million Soviet Jews came to Israel, 1.5 million. And we won. But why did they lose? Why did my parents' generation lose that fight? What did they do? So the first thing that I checked, for example, was the newspapers in the United States, Jewish and non-Jewish, to see what they knew and when they knew it. And lo and behold, they knew about the Holocaust. Already at the end of 42, they knew about the Holocaust. Okay? What did they do? Where did they go wrong? And I mean, I can talk about this for hours, okay? And numerous books have been written about it. But I would say to you that some of our successes, let's say like in the Soviet Jewry movement in Israel, are fueled by that failure. By that failure. When we said never again, it wasn't only never again will we stand by, in other words, never again will Jews be murdered, but never again will we stand by and not raise our voices because we're afraid of double loyalties, say in America, okay? We're afraid what the Goyim will say, etc. Jan Karski went to FDR, met with FDR, and he told him. But you know something? Just remember one thing. We are post-Auschwitz generation. So if someone talks to us about these things, we know what happened. This is before this ever happened. In other words, this happened for the first time then. Think if someone would tell you, okay, let's say in 1938, all right, that there will be industrial factories built for the mass murder of human beings in Poland, and 3 million Jews will be murdered in those, and another 3 million murdered by shooting, etc. And this all happened in the course of 5 years, 4 years actually, okay? What they say to you, you're crazy. How could such a thing happen? I personally have been to Rwanda twice, and I helped the government, I advised the government on issues like justice and things like this. Okay, Rwanda happened because Rwanda was in Africa, in the heart of Africa, and you'll excuse me, no one gave a about them. Okay? So our goal is to sensitize people and make them understand that their choices make a difference. Okay? That you can't turn away. If you see things like this, you have to speak out, and you have to try and help. So the problem, listen, you know what, I'll tell you even more. The events of the last 3 years with the Arab Spring, when it turned into winter, right? And the refugee crisis, you see that Europe and America, especially under Obama, are under enormous moral failure. You see it. This is one of the reasons why people hate Israel, because Israel can defend itself. Israel's not asking for any soldiers to come defend it. Israel's willing to put its lives on the line to save this place, which is a bastard of democracy. Israel is the country that should be the most admired country in the world. Instead, it's one of the most hated countries in the world. It makes no sense whatsoever. But if you think about what Israel stands for, and you know how difficult that is in Europe and in other places, you understand why they hate Israel, because Israel shows them that they're not doing what they should be doing. Listen, why did Rwanda develop the way it developed? Because Bill Clinton, okay, was afraid to say that it's genocide. Because if he had admitted that it was genocide, he would have to do something about it. He realized he had made a terrible mistake in Rwanda. He actually went there to apologize, believe it or not. The Turks have still not admitted that they committed genocide against the Armenians, because they don't have the moral fiber to be able to face their past honestly. And there's no real tradition of human rights there. And, this is Erdogan. Erdogan is what? He's a paragon of what? He's a paragon of brutality. He's a paragon of anti-Semitism. What else do you want to know? How I do what I do. I do it because it has to be done, but someone has to do it. So I'm happy to do it. I come here, I wake up every morning a happy man, knowing that I'm doing something that counts. How many people can say that? Okay, let me tell you a story about what we do. Everyone thinks that, we know everything about the Holocaust and that most of the Nazis are dead. And what I try to explain to them, I do a lot of lecturing to teachers who come to Yad Vashem for courses on the Holocaust from all over the world. It's a very good program they're running there. In any event, I'll tell you one story that we're working on right now. A year ago, a little more than a year ago, 2 Danish historians wrote a book called School for Violence. Okay? The story is about a camp set up by the Nazis in Babrusk, in Belarus, to which 1,500 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto were deported in 1942 to serve as slaves there in this camp. And the camp was run, there was German commander and deputy commander, but the people running the camp were Danish SS volunteers. Now, normally, when people think about Denmark, Denmark, that's the one ray of light. They saved most of their Jews, 7,500 out of 8,000, were saved from deportation. They were sent to Sweden. And that's true, and it's wonderful. And the Danes deserve credit for that, no question. But what most people don't know is that 6,000 Danes volunteered for the SS, Waffen-SS. They were sent to the east, and they were the ones, 800 to 1,000 of them ran this camp. Now, from October 42 until May 43 is when the Danes were there, okay? During that period, I think it's about 98% of the Jews were murdered or died of the conditions. In other words, this was like a death camp. No gas chambers, no gas vans, but the result was like a death camp. Now, I read this book. I didn't read the book. I read about the book because I don't read Danish. Okay, I said to myself, 1 second, this is amazing. And they said in the book that they found one of the people. So I wrote a letter to the Danish justice minister and said, this is the information, this is the book, it's in Danish, you can read it, okay? And we suggest that you investigate to see whether any other people from this camp, served in the camp, are alive. Took us 6 months to answer me, okay? She said, we don't do investigations. I said, oh really? You're the Justice Ministry? Hello? She said, if you have some complaint, you have to come to submit the complaint to the Danish police. I go, okay. Last July, a couple months ago, I go with one of the historians who I met with, and we spoke out the whole issues and all this, and we go to the police, and I gave her a complaint. And for the last 4 months, we have a research project in Denmark, which this historian and another historian living in Denmark, a guy who I know who's been very helpful to us in other issues, went through the archives to try and find whether any other people from those units might be alive. And we found over 40 names, people with theory might be alive, and a couple of them are alive, about 3 or 4 apparently. Okay, and now those names were submitted to the police. So that's how we do what we do. Now, but I have to tell you one thing. You have to understand, we operate under a tremendous obstacle. The obstacle is that normally when a crime is committed, the police try and find out who committed the crime. So they start with the crime and then try and see who committed the crime. But in our case, if we start with the crime, we'd be wasting 98% of our time, or 99% of our time, because 98 and 99% of the people who committed the crimes in the Shoah are no longer alive. So what do? We start with tips. People come to us with information about people who are alive today and healthy enough to stand trial, who may or may not be Nazis. Then we have to confirm it. Then we have to check whether or not that's true. But listen, we have this Operation Last Chance. I'll show you the poster in the main room here. Okay, we got money from a German PR firm called Val AG. AG means limited or something in German. It's a family, people who are very friendly to Jews, very helpful to the Jewish community. They gave us $750,000 euros worth of free advertising. And basically what we did was we put up this poster, 2,000 of these posters, or 3,000 of these posters, in Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne, 2 summers ago. Okay? And we got the names of 111 people who may or may not be Nazi war criminals. Now, the problem is that most of the information we get is worthless, basically. So, for example, the most common thing the most common phone call that we would get, it goes something like this, okay? Hello, is this the Wiesenthal Center? Yes. Are you still hunting Nazis? Yes. In some cases they ask, are you still offering money? Yes. Okay? Well, I want to tell you, okay, that last week I had this terrible fight with my neighbor, who's a 92-year-old German, who must be a Nazi war criminal. No? It's obviously not credible. So out of those 111 names, ultimately 4 were turned over to the prosecution. Okay? Just to give you an idea. Listen, in Operation Last Chance, we started in the Baltic countries, thanks to Aryeh Rubin's contribution from the Targum Shlishi Foundation in Miami. Okay? We got some 800 names. 108 about were turned over to prosecutors. Okay? Because in some countries, like in America, they have a big unit and they can deal with it much better than we can, okay? But 8 actual cases evolved from that information. And a case evolved in which some legal action of some sort was taken against these people. People always ask us, actually, how many Nazis are still alive? So my answer is the following. First of all, you have to remember the scope of the crime. There's hundreds and hundreds of thousands and millions of people were involved in the mass murder of the Jews and other victims of the Nazis. Okay? And some of them were young. But the most dramatic development from our perspective in this whole issue has been the extension of life expectancy. In other words, if 70 years after the Shoah were in 1920, there wouldn't be any alive, or virtually none, okay? But we're in 2015, okay? And most of these people live in countries with good medical care, like in Germany and Austria, for example, Western countries. So it applies also to Nazis. Even though, and the truth of the matter, I sometimes say that people without a conscience live longer. So a lot of them are alive. First of all, Abu Mazen's doctorate was written about the Holocaust. He denied the Holocaust in his doctorate. He later made some comments to the effect that he didn't believe it anymore. But the problem with him is very simple. All you have to do is read the publications of the Palestinian Authority in Arabic. Now, I don't read Arabic, okay, but there's something called, there are two very wonderful, very important institutions called Memory and Palestinian Media Watch. They produced the information in English. In other words, they translated it into English. And you know what? It's very simple. When the Oslo Accords were made, I said give it a chance, okay? Abu Mazen and the Palestinians have convinced me that there's no partner, absolutely no partner at this point in time. In other words, if they're busy glorifying suicide bombers and naming football, soccer tournaments for people who were suicide bombers and showing maps without Israel on the map and talking about eliminating Israel, what's there to talk about? Listen, thank God State of Israel is not about to commit suicide, and Abu Mazen can jump into the Mediterranean as far as I'm concerned.
We are back. Now we're going to go to a very serious topic. It's called the response of Orthodox Jewry in the United States to the Holocaust. The activities of Vad Hatzalah Rescue Committee. Vad means committee and Hatzalah means to save. And it's written by Efraim Zuroff. And it's a very, very controversial subject, and I'm glad someone wrote about it, because there have been many rumors, and we'll talk to the doctor about it, that many rabbis, because of their own beliefs and their own concepts of how Judaism should behave in a sense, told many of their followers not to leave the Holocaust areas, the regions at Hungary and Germany and et cetera, and they themselves somehow got out, and it's a tough subject. Welcome to the show, Doc. Hey, you work for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, so you are basically a Nazi hunter.
I'm the person in the Wiesenthal Center who's responsible for all the research on Nazi war criminals, for the political lobbying, and for doing whatever is possible, even at this point, to bring Nazi war criminals to justice.
All right, why did you get interested in this topic?
I did graduate work at the Institute of Contemporary Jewry and chose the Holocaust as my specialization because I couldn't understand how such a thing could take place. And you have to remember...
Okay, be careful, because a lot of our people don't know, and a lot of people are not Jewish. How such a thing is what?
As the Holocaust.
Okay.
In other words, I grew up in the 60s.
Right.
Very activist period. The Jewish community was very militant on behalf of Soviet Jewry, on behalf of Israel. And it was my understanding that not that much had been done during the war to try and save the Jews.
Right.
And so I was very intrigued intellectually, and I started studying it. And the first paper I did as a graduate student was on what information was there in the Jewish press and in the New York Times regarding the crimes of the Nazis. I wanted to know what an average Jew sitting in his living room in New York or in Detroit or Boston could have known about those crimes while they were taking place.
Right.
And I found some amazing information, that there was plenty of details about the crimes themselves. And in the winter of 1942, it was common knowledge that millions of Jews were being murdered. On December 2nd, 1942, there was a worldwide day of mourning declared throughout the Jewish world, and 6 days later, a delegation of American Jewish leaders met with President Roosevelt at the White House, gave him a document called Blueprint for Extermination. 2 million Jews have been murdered. 5 million more European Jews are in danger of annihilation.
Well, there's a fellow named Peter Bergson. You know him?
Sure.
Changed his name now. It's Hillel.
No, his name was Hillel Cook. He went under the pseudonym of Peter Bergson.
He was screaming this in the 40s. He's been on the show. He's paralyzed today. But he was screaming about this.
Well, he's really one of the heroes in the sense that they did everything possible, in some cases together with the rabbis of the Vad Hatzalah Rescue Committee, to activate the community and make rescue the #1 priority.
Okay, so what happened?
Well, it's a long story, and it doesn't begin in 1943. It begins in 1939, when after the Soviet invasion of Poland, about 1,500, 1,600 rabbis and yeshiva students from the elite yeshivas, Mir, Kamenetz, Baranovitz, Kletz, Gradin, run away from Eastern Poland, which was invaded by the Soviets, because they know that the communists will close down the yeshivas, and move to...
Yeshivas are schools of learning.
They moved to Vilnius, which was handed over by the Soviets to the independent neutral Republic of Lithuania.
Right.
They arrive, they have to be housed, they have to be clothed, and an SOS...
It's the rabbis and the students?
The rabbis and the students.
Okay. They were tipped off?
No. In other words, the Soviets invaded on September 17th. On October 13th, they announced that they're handing over Vilna, which has been part of Poland,
Right.
to independent Lithuania.
Right.
The rabbis and the students, I should say, in some cases the students who dragged the rabbis,
Right.
realized this was an opportunity to get away from communist rule, because
Right.
they knew that the communists would close down the Talmudic academies.
Right.
And they said, we got to get out of there. Some of them even traveled on the Sabbath to get across the border to the new border, to Lithuania.
Right.
They arrive in Lithuania, and SOS goes out to American Orthodox rabbis, help us. This is an emergency situation. We have...
Did the Orthodox community in America have a separate relationship with the Orthodox Jews in Europe? It wasn't under this umbrella of all Jewish organizations, etc.?
Okay. During the interwar period, the ties between the Orthodox Jews in America and the Orthodox Jews in Eastern Europe, primarily in Lithuania and Poland, had been considerably strengthened. And the Jews in America basically became the main financial basis for the Jewish institutions in Eastern Europe.
I see.
To the point even where the heads of these yeshivas used to come to America for 2, 3, 4 months to raise money. And American boys even went to Europe to study in these Talmudic academies.
So there's an exchange.
Right. And the rabbis in America were all graduates, I use the term loosely, with quotation marks, of these same yeshivas which ran away to Vilna.
Okay, so
the crisis situation, the rabbis decided to set up a special rescue committee. Now, on the surface, that seems like a natural decision. Only there's a much deeper problem, because aid by American Jews to Jews in distress overseas already had an address. That's the Joint Distribution Committee. Right. And 10 months previously, for the first time ever, American Jewry had united to form the United Jewish Appeal. So obviously it's better to have one main fundraising address for Palestine, for Jews in distress, and for absorption of refugees. Along come the rabbis and they say, listen, we don't trust the communal framework to give absolute priority to the rabbis and yeshiva students.
Why should the rabbis have priority?
Oh, see, because the Agudat HaRabbanim, or the Union of Orthodox Rabbis of the United States and Canada, believed that rabbis and yeshiva students are the very essence of the Jewish people. Without them, there is no Jewish people, and therefore they deserve top priority at all costs in every situation.
You believe that?
Listen, this is what they believed, and that's the decision that they made.
Do you believe it?
Listen, I think that that's a very difficult decision to make, and it's a very problematic decision.
It's probably anti-Jewish, because under Judaism, as I believe it, every human being is sacred. So how do you make a discrimination? I'll tell you the problem that I had. I was saving Jews in Russia in the 70s. I worked in the Senate for Vance Hartke, and I had blanket stationery to save Russian Jews. I was doing it under the auspices of Golda Meir. She asked me to do it. And one thing I didn't want to be is the person who chose who should have liberation and who should not liberation. So in a sense, I'd put a lottery together, and I would pick names out, and then I never wanted to meet any of the people that I saved. Because I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do, and to use my power and influence to be able to do it. But to go say that I should save a rabbi versus a doctor, or a doctor versus a bricklayer, I think that's anti-Jewish.
Well, to be entirely fair, a lot of different Jewish organizations did the same thing. In other words, the Zionist movement tried to save its activists. The labor movement tried to save its activists. But basically what the rabbis did in this case, they were bolting the communal framework. In other words, an argument could be made, let's work together, we'll be more effective, and by working inside the framework, we'll also make sure that rabbis are given certain consideration, which as spiritual leaders, they undoubtedly did deserve, but not absolute priority. That's a completely different story.
So This can't be a very exciting book to a lot of the Orthodox Jewish community today.
Well, to put it quite frankly, they said, some of them wrote in their publications that I'm worse than David Irving, and that this is a blood libel. Now, for someone who's devoted his entire life to researching the Holocaust, to bringing Nazi war criminals to justice, this comes as a bit of an insult, as you can imagine.
A bit? Yeah.
I'm saying it facetiously.
Right.
But on the other hand, listen, I understand. Their problem is there's no transparency, there's no accountability, and there's no willingness to analyze the decision-making process in the ultra-Orthodox world the way it's done everywhere else.
Now, do we separate the Orthodox Agudat Harabanim, which is the Union of Orthodox Rabbis, and a Hasidim? That's another?
Listen, let me explain something. The rabbis who headed this committee, there were Agudat rabbis, Agudat Yisrael, who were ultra-Orthodox. There were Mizrahi rabbis who were religious Zionists. But the people who really set the tone were rabbis like Eliezer Silva of Cincinnati, who was the head of the Agudat Yisrael, and rabbis like Rav Aaron Kotler, who was a Rosh Yeshiva in Kletsk and later built the Lakewood Yeshiva, Rabbi Kalmanovitz from Mir, people who are really ultra-Orthodox.
And I got to explain this to the audience. These are all major Jewish academies of learning. And these rabbis were scholars, and they're the ones that came from Europe and established these academies in the United States. That's basically what happened. But
right, some of the people saved by this Vadatzoh set up the Torah institutions that are today the premier Torah institutions in the United States of America.
Right. Okay, but that's one end of it. Now, what happened with the Hasidic rabbis?
Okay, the Hasidic rabbis are an entirely different story. They were organized...
You talk about them in your book also?
There's not that much on them, but their story is also fascinating because many of them, particularly the ones who were most extreme, most anti-Zionist, for years told their followers that they shouldn't go to Palestine or make aliyah, as they say, go up to the land of Israel. And afterwards, there was quite a bit of disenchantment among Jews who said, we would have loved to go to Palestine, but our religious leadership told us that Palestine is not the place to go. I mean, you'll lose your soul in Palestine because Israel is a secular country, not governed by Jewish law. Now, in some cases, these rabbis ultimately escaped, leaving behind many of their followers. One case in particular that stands out and is relatively well known is of the Rebbe of Belz, who escaped from Poland, reached Hungary, and shortly before the Nazis invaded the country, gave a sermon to many Jews in which he said, "Don't worry, everything will be all right." That night he left for Palestine. 2 days later, the Nazis invaded Hungary. So you can imagine that this could engender a crisis of belief among many Jews. But, I mean, those people who are ultra-Orthodox, of course, believe that these people are infallible. So something akin to papal infallibility.
That's right. When a Hasidic rabbi speaks, his followers, they're in a sense blind followers. Whatever the rabbi says or Rebbe says, they follow. So if the Rebbe said, stay here and don't go to Israel, these people would not go and stay. The fact that he himself went is unusual and should be explored, I guess. It's the Belzer Rebbe, huh?
All right. Now, you have a lot of stories. I mean, in my book, I dealt with the situation of these Talmudic academies who ran away to Vilna. And it's interesting that the first thing some of these rabbis did was to write letters to the Jewish Agency asking for certificates to be able to go to Palestine. Now, these are rabbis who were anti-Zionist. In other words, they were in Aguda, and they were not out there promoting Jewish immigration to Palestine. But of course, when this crisis erupted, they were looking for a way to save themselves and their students. So of course, Palestine was one option. Some of them also wrote letters to the United States begging for American visas. And you know, this is a painful thing.
Did the Vadat Salah have any connection with Roosevelt? Did they have any inns over there?
No, they did not have inns. And as a matter of fact, there's a very famous story, an important story. The only demonstration by Jewish political leaders in Washington calling for rescue efforts was by 400 Orthodox rabbis who marched in Washington on October 6, 1943, 2 days before Yom Kippur. But Roosevelt had received advice from some of his Jewish advisors who were not sympathetic to the Vaad Hatzalah or to the revisionist group, the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe. And they told Roosevelt that this group of rabbis doesn't represent the mainstream of the Jewish community, and he refused to meet them when they came to Washington, even though it's clear from his diary that he could have met them. In other words, he didn't have a very busy day.
Yeah, but you're saying, and I've been in the White House and worked for a president, he had conflicting opinions from different advisors. And what happened is he had a Jewish advisor telling him not to meet with this Jewish committee. So in a sense, can you blame Roosevelt? He's saying, here, I got a Jewish advisor who says don't meet. You know, who knows?
I may not blame Roosevelt for that specific meeting, but the fact remains that I think part of the problem here was that the Nazi propaganda always said that the Jews had dragged America into the war. And this was a Jewish war. And Roosevelt was very wary lest he in any way strengthen that canard. And it was clear that he avoided taking any specific action until very late in the war, until finally the War Refugee Board was set up in January of 1944.
He had knowledge in the 40s, early 40s, about the Jewish problem and the fact that Jews were being destroyed.
Listen, persecution certainly, but listen, in December of 1942, he got this report. 2 million Jews murdered, 5 million more in danger of annihilation, and a country-by-country breakdown. The situation in every single country. So, in other words, the information was out there, and that, of course, makes it that much harder to deal with the lack of activity. But I'll give you an example. The Vaad Hatzalah itself made an in-principle decision on January 5th, 6th, 1944, from now on to try and save all Jews, regardless of religiosity or affiliation. Okay? In other words, they knew about the final solution in late 42. It took them over a year to finally make that decision to change their own policy.
Why? Politics?
No, it's just a question of internalization. Information doesn't ensure comprehension. In other words, you have to internalize the information. You have to fully understand what it means. But I'll tell you another story that's interesting. In 1944, the Vaad Hatzalah sent $420,000 into occupied Europe to save Jews from deportation and murder. And it was done by smuggling Jews from one country to another. In other words, Jews who were in a country like Hungary, where the deportations were proceeding at a very fast pace, were smuggled to Romania, where there were no deportations. It was used to forge documents. It's a very important...
Was this only for Orthodox Jews?
No. This is for everybody.
Everybody.
Okay? This is for everybody. $420,000. At the same time, during the same year, they sent over $250,000 to two groups of rabbis and yeshiva students who were out of harm's way. In Shanghai was one group, and in Central Asia, Bukhara, Samarkand, Tashkent, that area, another group. These groups, those two groups, were at the same time being assisted by the Joint Distribution Committee in Shanghai and by the Joint Distribution Committee and Jewish Agency in Central Asia. So the extra money that was being sent to these rabbis and yeshiva students enabled them to sit and learn. In other words, the Vaad Hatzalah didn't say to these people, close your Gemaras, your Talmuds, for 6 months. We're in the midst of the most terrible tragedy in the history of the Jewish people. We have a way of saving people. We have the channels. We have the operation. We will send every single penny into occupied Europe. But even they didn't do that. But listen, it's important. Because until now, what was written, for example, in the Orthodox world, was purely laudatory. In other words, the Vaad Hatzalah were the greatest bunch of guys who did fantastic things, and they were the only ones out there saving Jews.
Yeah, and that's not true.
No, not by any stretch of the imagination.
Peace means taking into account the dignity of other people and the fact that there are other people who have certain rights.
Hello, welcome to the Charney Resolution Center. Today we have General Israela Oron. Hello, Israela. We wanted to ask you, how did you come to this field of study?
I was in the military, which is understood because I'm a general, a former lieutenant general. But during my military service, I realized that there are some issues you don't have a military solution for them. So we need to seek for another solution. And it would be the political solution for issues. And it would be dealing with reconciliation, dealing with the past.
Do you feel a difference in the audience, depending on if you talk to people in Israel, if you talk to younger or older people? Do you feel like they respond differently to your lectures?
I enjoyed very much my lecture here in front of you young people, because you are much more intelligent and you are open to new ideas, and you are not stuck in the past and all ideas that were presented to you, and you are willing to explore new things. So it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
The lecture was actually really interesting and gave us a perspective of what actually the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is. First of all, it simplified it, which may be a good or bad thing, but it gives you a perspective of how actually both sides live their life in. And she did not just give like solely examples from both sides, but rather things that are external, which can represent the same conflict. And I think that's really important when it comes to Israel, as there is not just one real story.
I think this lecture has been so interesting for all of us. I think it was really eye-opening, and I guess for all of us it was different in a way. I think I perceive it as an international student, so different than an Israeli or a Palestinian thought. And I found it really interesting when we talk about the definition of justice and how every single of us create our own definition with our own background and our own knowledge.
I don't think I can grasp the meaning of the word peace, because I haven't been living in peace my entire life. Mm-hmm. I've been living in conflict, in a conflict zone, an ongoing place of bloodshed and wars. So for me, there is a saying in Hebrew, Chie ten lichiot, means live and let others live as well.
I never heard the conflict so well structured and so easily to understand, and in such an open-minded way. I loved how she taught us. And yeah, for me, I guess now we know that we need to think about the past in a way that it's something that we learned to not do it in the future, and how we are going to do it next time, getting to know each other's opinions.
What advice would you give us as young people in order to achieve peace in the future?
To be open to the other side arguments, to the other side culture, to the other side opinions, and to understand where they are coming from. And then to decide what will be best, not only for your side, but what will be the win-win situation.
But do you think there is a win-win situation in regards to...
There is always a win-win situation. Unfortunately, some of the people that are leading both sides cannot see them. But there is only always a way if there is a will.
Thank you from the Charney Resolution Center, and see you next week.